You probably think you're normal. You go to work, make small talk, scroll through your feed, maybe argue a little online, then binge your favorite shows before bed. But what if I told you that the behaviors you see as normal might actually be symptoms of deep psychological dysfunction? In one Stanford study, over 65% of participants willingly obeyed commands they believed could harm another person, just because an authority figure told them to. Not in some dark corner of history, in a clean academic setting. And those participants, ordinary people, just like you, most of them left thinking they'd done nothing wrong. They walked away still believing they were normal. What if everything we've labeled as socially acceptable, compliance, silence, obsession with image, craving validation, is actually rooted in manipulation, fear, and unresolved trauma? What if being normal is just being well-adjusted to a profoundly unhealthy society? The normalcy illusion. You've been taught what's normal your entire life. Not through lectures, but through thousands of small silent signals. A raised eyebrow when you said the wrong thing. A classroom full of kids laughing when you didn't know the answer. A parent's disapproving look when you asked too many questions. Bit by bit, you learn to adjust, to smooth out the parts of yourself that didn't fit. And without realizing it, you started to measure your behavior not by what felt right, but by what wouldn't get you judged. That's the illusion of normalcy. It doesn't come from logic or truth. It comes from pressure, quiet, constant pressure to blend in. What's terrifying is how invisible this conditioning becomes. You dress a certain way not because you love the clothes, but because they make sense. You choose career paths not based on passion, but on what sounds respectable. You swallow your thoughts in meetings, smile politely when something feels wrong, and convince yourself that this is just how adults behave. And here's where the psychology starts to cut deep, because once enough people accept a behavior as normal, we stop questioning whether it's healthy, ethical, or even sane. We just adapt. Social psychologist Solomon Asch ran a series of experiments in the 1950s that still haunt behavioral science. In one version, participants were asked to compare the lengths of lines on a card. The correct answer was obvious. But when surrounded by other participants, actually actors, who all gave the wrong answer, over 75% of real participants conformed, knowingly choosing the wrong answer just to match the group. They didn't want to stand out. They didn't want to feel wrong. They didn't want to be abnormal. And that's where the illusion becomes dangerous, when people would rather be wrong with the crowd than right on their own. Now apply that to everyday life. Think about how often people stay silent about abuse, injustice, or dysfunction just to avoid the discomfort of being different. Think about how we normalize burnout, fake smiles, and empty small talk. Think about how children who show signs of deep anxiety are called shy, and those who speak out are called troublemakers. We pathologize sensitivity. We punish truth-telling. And slowly, we breed a culture where emotional suppression is seen as maturity. You've seen it in families where generational trauma is passed down like furniture, with no one daring to name it. You've seen it in schools where obedience is valued more than creativity, and silence is mistaken for respect. You've seen it in workplaces where overwork is praised, emotional numbness is rewarded, and anyone who questions the system is labeled negative or difficult. But the truth is, this isn't normal. It's just common. And there's a difference. In psychology, there's a concept called normative social influence. It refers to our tendency to conform, not because we believe others are right, but because we want to be accepted. It's survival instinct rooted in our evolutionary past, when being cast out from the tribe meant death. But in the modern world, this instinct can backfire. It can cause us to ignore red flags, stay in toxic relationships, or follow harmful trends, just because we don't want to be alone, just because we want to feel normal. But here's the twist. What if normal is the problem? A society can normalize anything if it does it long enough. Public executions were once family events. Smoking was once prescribed by doctors. Even slavery was once considered an economic necessity. In hindsight, we look back with horror and think, how could people believe that was normal? But what will future generations say about us? About the way we scroll past suffering, confuse online validation with self-worth, or raise children in systems that reward silence over authenticity. There's a haunting line from author Jiddu Krishnamurti. It is no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And yet, that's exactly what so many of us strive for, to be seen as well-adjusted. We take pride in how well we cope, not realizing that coping is sometimes just enduring dysfunction. We wear busyness like a badge. We mistake anxiety for ambition. We call people strong for surviving what they should never have gone through in the first place. That's not strength. That's an adaptation. And adaptation can be dangerous when it keeps us locked in systems that harm us. Look around. Look closely. The most normal people are often the most disconnected from themselves. The ones who never question the rules, who never rock the boat. They might look like they have it all together. But inside, many are numb, exhausted, terrified to be seen as too much or not enough. They play roles so convincingly that even they forget they're acting. They perform stability. They wear emotional masks. And they convince others that this is just what adulthood looks like. But it doesn't have to be. The moment you begin to question what you've been told is normal, when you pause and ask, wait, why do I do this? You're already stepping outside the illusion. That moment is uncomfortable, even painful. But it's also liberating. Because on the other side of that discomfort is a version of you that's more real, more awake, more alive. In the next chapter, we're going to go deeper. We'll explore how easy it is to obey authority, even when it leads to harm, and how this silent obedience shapes our behavior in ways most people never notice. But for now, ask yourself, how much of your life has been lived to avoid seeming abnormal? And what would happen if you stopped trying to blend in and started paying attention to what feels real instead of what looks right? The psychology of obedience. You'd like to believe you'd never follow a harmful order. That if someone told you to hurt another person, or to remain silent while something terrible happened, you'd speak up. You'd resist. You'd do the right thing. But history, psychology, and some of the most disturbing experiments ever conducted suggest something far more unsettling. Most people don't. In fact, many will comply with frightening ease, not because they're evil, but because they're human. And that's what makes it so terrifying. One of the most infamous demonstrations of this came from psychologist Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s. He wanted to understand how ordinary Germans participated in the Holocaust. Were they uniquely cruel? Or was there something deeper, something universal about human obedience? So he designed a seemingly simple experiment. Volunteers were told they'd be participating in a study on memory and learning. Their job was to administer electric shocks to a learner, an actor hidden behind a wall, every time they gave a wrong answer. With each mistake, the shocks increased in voltage. The learner began to cry out, then scream, then beg for mercy. Eventually, he went silent. But the researcher, dressed in a lab coat, calmly urged the participant to continue. The experiment requires that you continue, he'd say. And here's the part that still haunts psychology. 65 of participants went all the way to the highest voltage, 450 volts, even when they believed the person on the other side might be dead. These weren't psychopaths. They were teachers, accountants, postal workers, regular people, people who laughed nervously, sweated through their shirts, questioned morality, but kept going. Because someone in authority told them to. Because stopping would mean disobeying. Because in that moment, obedience felt safer than resistance. And before you think, well, that was the 60s, people were different, consider this. The experiment has been replicated in various forms all over the world across decades, and the results remain eerily consistent. Humans, when placed in a structured environment with authoritative pressure, will often override their own conscience, even when it screams at them to stop. It's not that we don't know something's wrong. It's that we've been trained to believe that going along is the lesser sin. This doesn't just happen in labs. You see it in offices, where employees follow toxic policies they disagree with. In hospitals, where staff remain silent about unethical practices to avoid consequences. In schools, where students participate in hazing rituals, knowing they're harmful, but feeling trapped by tradition. The mechanism is the same. Pressure plus authority equals obedience. And when that pressure becomes systemic, People begin to confuse silence with professionalism, compliance with integrity. Obedience also thrives on hierarchy. When a system is built on ranks, titles, or seniority, questioning becomes dangerous. Don't ask questions. Just do your job. This is how it's always been. These phrases aren't just annoying, they're psychological control tools. They quietly condition you to shut down your instincts, to outsource your moral judgment, to keep your head down and your mouth shut. And the more often you comply, the easier it becomes to justify. I'm just following orders turns into, I don't want to rock the boat, which turns into, it's not really my responsibility. And suddenly, you're part of the machine, complicit without realizing it. Now let's shift to the famous Stanford prison experiment in 1971. In this study, college students were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a mock prison. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. It had to be shut down in 6 days. Why? Because the guards became disturbingly cruel. They humiliated the prisoners, enforced arbitrary punishments, and psychologically broke them down. And the prisoners? Many became passive, numb, and submissive, forgetting it was just an experiment. The roles became real. The masks fused with their identities. And no one, not even the lead researcher, Philip Zimbardo, who played the prison superintendent, realized just how quickly the line between performance and reality can disappear. This experiment revealed something profoundly disturbing. Put people in a position of authority, strip others of power, and within days you create monsters and victims. Not because anyone was born that way, but because context is more powerful than character. When systems reward obedience and punish resistance, the psychology of submission becomes a survival instinct. So how does this play out in your life? Maybe it's when you laugh at a joke you find offensive, just because everyone else did. Or when you go along with a group decision you disagree with because saying no would make you difficult. Maybe it's when you see someone being mistreated, a coworker, a friend, a stranger, and you look away. Not because you don't care, but because stepping in feels risky. Because somewhere deep inside, you've been trained to think that staying quiet is what adults do. But silence isn't neutrality. It's participation. Inaction is still action, just quieter. Obedience doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like politeness, like professionalism, like being nice. And that's why it's so dangerous, because it hides behind civility. The dark truth is, the more you follow without questioning, the harder it becomes to recognize when something is wrong. And the more you silence your discomfort, the more that silence becomes your default setting. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in micro-decisions, the times you say nothing, the times you agree to things you shouldn't, the times you convince yourself, it's not my place. But here's the most chilling part. People often feel relieved when someone else takes responsibility for their actions. In follow-up interviews from Milgram's study, participants said things like, "I was just doing what I was told," or "the scientists said it was okay." They transferred blame upward, a psychological escape hatch that allowed them to maintain their self-image. "I'm still a good person," they believed. "I was just following instructions." That mental trick, that shift of moral responsibility, is what makes atrocities possible. From war crimes to workplace abuse, the script remains the same. Someone gives the order, someone follows, and everyone pretends no one's really at fault. Ask yourself, is this right, or just familiar? Is this safe, or just accepted? Because sometimes, resistance isn't about rebellion. It's about remembering who you are beneath the programming. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the masks people wear to survive, how unresolved trauma gets buried under performance, smiles, and having it all together. Because once obedience becomes your default, it doesn't just shape what you do. It reshapes who you believe you are. Chapter 3, Social Masks and Hidden Trauma. You can't always see trauma. It doesn't always look like panic attacks, breakdowns, or dramatic confessions. In fact, it often wears a smile. It gets up early, answers emails, holds polite conversations, and says, "I'm fine," when it's anything but. One of the darkest truths about human psychology is this. The more deeply someone is hurt, the more skilled they often become at pretending everything is okay. And the more convincingly they perform normal, the more invisible that pain becomes, not just to others, but to themselves. You've probably worn a mask before. Maybe you're still wearing one. The kind that tells the world you're in control, that you're capable, that you're not struggling. These masks aren't made of lies. They're made of survival. You learned early on that being too emotional, too sensitive, too honest was risky. That showing weakness could be used against you. So you adapted. You smiled when you wanted to cry. You laughed at things that hurt. You showed up when you wanted to disappear. And eventually, the mask became part of you. Psychologically, this is called emotional suppression. And while it may help you function, it comes at a cost. Studies have shown that chronic emotional suppression is linked to increased anxiety, depression, memory issues, and even immune dysfunction. When you bury feelings for long enough, your body doesn't forget. It turns those unspoken emotions into tension, fatigue, and chronic stress. But since everyone else is doing it too, we call it adulthood. We normalize the burnout. We celebrate the performance. In therapy, there's a phrase, functional trauma. It refers to people who've been through pain, but instead of collapsing, they become hyperproductive, hyper-independent, hyper-responsible. These are the people who say, I don't need help, who take care of everyone else but feel nothing inside. They're not okay, they're efficient. And efficiency becomes their disguise. Their trauma doesn't scream. It gets things done. The most disturbing part? Society rewards this. You get promoted for hiding your exhaustion, praised for pushing through emotional pain, admired for how together you are. Even if you cry alone in your car, we confuse numbness with maturity. We applaud self-neglect as self-discipline. And the deeper someone sinks into emotional isolation, the more they're seen as strong. But real strength isn't how well you suppress your pain. It's how honestly you face it. Take the story of Emma, a high-performing executive, always polished, always in control. On paper, she had it all: career success, social respect, financial security. But inside, she felt hollow, disconnected. Her days were structured, her calendar full, yet nothing felt real. In therapy, it unraveled childhood emotional neglect, a father who valued results over feelings, a mother who dismissed every tear with, "You're just being dramatic." So Emma adapted. She became competent, pleasant, reliable. Her entire adult identity was built around avoiding the very feelings she was never allowed to have. That mask, refined, efficient, likable, became her prison. She's not alone. You see it everywhere. People who become perfectionists not out of ambition but fear. People who play the joker not because they're happy, but because humor keeps others at a distance. People who avoid conflict like a plague, not because they're peaceful, but because they associate disagreement with danger. Every mask has a story, and every story starts with a wound. Here's where it gets darker. The longer someone wears a mask, the more disconnected they become from their true self. They forget what they enjoy, what they believe, what they feel. Their personality becomes a performance, refined by feedback, shaped by approval. And deep down, there's a question that haunts them. If I stopped performing, would anyone still want me? That's the tragedy of hidden trauma. It doesn't just rob you of peace. It robs you of you. And yet, this behavior is everywhere, especially in high-functioning adults. It's how people survive dysfunctional homes, abusive relationships, toxic workplaces. It's how they stay employed, stay included, stay okay. They become masters of the mask. And the more masks you wear, the more exhausting life becomes. Every conversation feels scripted. Every day feels like a role you have to play. You smile at people who drain you. You say yes when you mean no. You don't even realize you're dissociating because you've been doing it for years. This leads to what psychologists call identity diffusion, when a person becomes so fragmented between different roles that they lose sight of who they are when no one's watching. It's not always a dramatic breakdown. Sometimes it shows up as quiet emptiness, a vague sadness, a life that looks full but feels meaningless. So what's the solution? First, awareness. You can't heal what you can't name. Start noticing the moments where you feel like you're acting. Ask yourself, am I doing this because I want to, or because it's expected? Does this version of me feel real or rehearsed? These questions may not lead to immediate answers, but they begin to crack the mask. Second, discomfort. Real healing doesn't happen in comfort zones. If you've been conditioned to suppress, opening up will feel unsafe, even wrong. You might fear being judged, misunderstood, or even abandoned. But that fear isn't proof you're doing something bad. It's proof you're touching something real. And what's real is where healing lives. Finally, self-reconnection. Trauma disconnects you from your own internal signals, your needs, your boundaries, your emotions. Reconnecting means learning to sit with discomfort, express without apology, and feel without shame. It means reclaiming parts of yourself that were silenced, shamed, or ignored. And yes, this is terrifying work. But here's the most beautiful truth. You were never meant to be a mask. You were meant to be whole. In the next chapter, we're going to explore what happens when masks become collective, when entire groups, communities, and institutions abandon truth in favor of unity, and when groupthink replaces critical thinking. Because when enough people share the same mask, they start to forget it's even there. Groupthink and the madness of crowds. When one person believes a lie, we call it delusion. But when thousands believe it together, we call it culture. That's the dark genius of group psychology. The way it reshapes truth, morality, and behavior without anyone realizing it's happening. The scariest part? Most people don't lose their minds in isolation. They lose their minds in groups, surrounded by people who seem equally convinced, equally certain, equally normal. And in that echo, it becomes harder and harder to think for yourself. Groupthink is the psychological phenomenon where a group, in the name of harmony or unity, suppresses dissenting opinions, ignores warning signs, and makes irrational decisions, all while believing they're acting intelligently. It doesn't require mind control or propaganda. It just needs enough people in the room who are unwilling to speak up. And as voices go silent, a terrifying thing happens. Consensus begins to feel like truth. This isn't theory. It's history. Think about the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986. Engineers had raised concerns, serious ones, about technical issues that could cause the shuttle to explode. But the organizational culture at NASA was so focused on pushing forward, on protecting the timeline, on maintaining the image of competence, that those warnings were dismissed. Meetings were filled with optimistic data, comforting slogans, and pressure to agree. The launch went ahead. 73 seconds later, the shuttle exploded. 7 lives lost. Not because people didn't know, but because they did and said nothing. The mechanics of groupthink are disturbingly subtle. It often begins with unspoken rules. Don't challenge the leader. Don't slow down progress. Don't be the negative one. People who break these rules aren't punished outright. They're quietly ignored, subtly mocked, or labeled as difficult. Eventually, others get the message. Blend in or be pushed out. So they stay quiet. And that silence snowballs. The more people who conform, the riskier it feels to question. The group becomes a mirror reflecting only what it already believes. This is how entire communities become complicit in harm without any single person intending to do so. It's how religious groups cover up abuse. How corporate scandals unfold in plain sight. How nations descend into cruelty while calling it patriotism. Not because people are monsters, but because in groups, the fear of exclusion often outweighs the fear of doing wrong. Social psychologist Irving Janis, who coined the term groupthink, found that the more cohesive a group is, the more likely it is to fall into this trap. Especially if there's a charismatic leader, external pressure, or a shared sense of moral mission. In other words, the very things that make groups feel powerful, unity, identity, purpose, can also make them blind. You've probably felt this on a smaller scale. Maybe in a friend circle where everyone agrees something is funny, even when it isn't. Or in a classroom where no one raises their hand to question the teacher, so neither do you. Or in a workplace where a clearly bad decision gets passed around like it's brilliant, and you start to wonder if you're the crazy one. That creeping self-doubt? That's groupthink at work. The danger isn't just bad decisions. The self-erasure. People start to distrust their instincts, rewrite their memories, soften their language. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I'm just overreacting. Maybe they're right. And little by little, they lose the ability to tell what's real. Because the group's version of reality becomes louder than their own. Psychologically, this taps into our need for belonging, one of the most primal human drives. We're wired to avoid rejection. In ancient times, isolation meant death. So we compromise. We shape our opinions to match the room. We smile when we feel sick. We nod along to things we disagree with. And the more we do it, the easier it becomes to confuse fitting in with being safe. But there's a cost to that safety. Studies on whistleblowers, the rare individuals who break group silence to expose wrongdoing, show that they often suffer severe consequences. Job loss, social exile, mental breakdowns, not because they were wrong, but because they broke the illusion. They punctured the group's fantasy of righteousness. And groups don't take kindly to being awakened. One of the most chilling real-world examples is the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Over the span of 100 days, nearly 1 million people were slaughtered by their neighbors, co-workers, even family members, all under the influence of collective hatred fueled by propaganda. Ordinary citizens turned violent not because they were born evil, but because they were swept into a social current so strong, resistance felt impossible. That's the extreme end of groupthink, when shared delusion becomes shared destruction. Even in less dramatic settings, groupthink can slowly chip away at conscience. It can make you laugh at cruelty, defend injustice, or stay silent while someone else suffers. Not because you want to, but because everyone else seems fine with it. And that's the madness. When enough people ignore their moral compass, the absence of morality begins to feel moral. So how do you resist it? It starts with discomfort. Being the voice of dissent never feels good. It makes you shaky, exposed, uncertain. But that discomfort is a sign you're thinking independently. It's a psychological alarm, not that you're wrong, but that you're no longer hypnotized by the group. The key is learning to tolerate that feeling, to pause before agreeing, to ask, do I believe this? Or am I just afraid to say otherwise? It also means seeking out disagreement, not as conflict, but as protection. Surrounding yourself with people who challenge your ideas. Reading things that make you uncomfortable. Listening to voices outside your echo chamber. Because when everyone around you agrees all the time, it's not harmony, it's stagnation. Growth happens in friction. And perhaps most importantly, it means remembering that conscience doesn't come from consensus. Right and wrong aren't decided by vote. Sometimes, truth sounds like a whisper in a shouting crowd. And if you've got the courage to listen, really listen, you might just hear it. In the final chapter, we're going to turn inward. We'll explore how to break free from the programming, how to question the definitions of normal you've inherited and start rebuilding a life that actually reflects you. Because once you see through the illusions of obedience, masking, and groupthink, there's no going back, and that's where real freedom begins. The psychology of unseen influence, you've probably heard the phrase, you're more influenced than you think. It sounds like a harmless truth. Something you might see on a motivational poster or in a psychology class. But what if I told you that statement barely scratches the surface of how deeply your behavior, decisions, and even thoughts are being shaped, right now, without your knowledge? Let's begin with something as simple as your favorite snack. You might think you chose it because you like the taste. But in a 2012 study by the Cornell Food and Brand Lab, researchers found that participants consistently overestimated their personal preference and underestimated the effect of branding, music, lighting, and even the smell of the room on their food choices. In one version of the experiment, people claimed to love a specific wine, believing it was an expensive French bottle, only to later discover it was a 5 bottle from California. Their taste didn't change. Their perception did. That's the unsettling truth. Your mind doesn't just react to the world. It interprets it through invisible filters you don't even know are there. Think about the last time you entered a store. Were you aware that the items placed at your eye level were carefully chosen to manipulate your purchase decisions? That the music playing in the background was selected based on psychological profiles to keep you in the store longer? or that the scent pumped into the air was part of a multi-million-dollar marketing strategy designed to stimulate your memory and emotion centers. Now scale that up. Social media platforms use algorithms not just to show you what you like. They train you to like what they want to show you. Behavioral reinforcement loops keep you scrolling by giving you hits of dopamine when you engage in specific ways. It's not just that you are influenced. It's that you're being trained without knowing it. Like a lab rat chasing cheese it doesn't realize has been placed for a reason. In 2010, Facebook conducted an experiment on 689,000 users without their consent. They altered the emotional content of people's news feeds to see if it could influence their moods. And it worked. When users were shown more negative posts, they started posting more negative content themselves. When they were shown more positive ones, their posts followed suit. It was one of the first large-scale digital demonstrations of what psychologists call emotional contagion. But it also highlighted something more disturbing. Your emotions can be engineered. This isn't just about ads or purchases anymore. This is about how your perception of reality is being sculpted day by things you don't notice. You think you're forming independent opinions, but most of the time, you're responding to pre-curated narratives, edited headlines, selective images, and biased algorithms. The disturbing part is how confidently we defend these manipulated perceptions as our own. Let's zoom in again closer to home. Have you ever found yourself picking up a habit from someone just by spending time with them? Mirroring their speech patterns, adopting their values, shifting your opinions slightly to match theirs? That's the human brain's mirror neuron system at work. It's why we unconsciously mimic the people around us, because thousands of years ago, it helped us survive in tribes. But today, it means our beliefs, identities, and even political views can shift, not through conscious thought, but through social exposure. This is how extremism spreads. Not in leaps, but in nudges. A Reddit thread here, a provocative video there, a few influencer tweets sprinkled in between. 1 degree at a time, someone can go from apolitical to radicalized. And it doesn't even feel like a transformation. It feels like waking up. Perhaps the most unsettling influence comes from the people you love. Studies have shown that we are more likely to adopt the fears, biases, and coping mechanisms of our parents than we are to recognize them as separate from our own personality. We inherit trauma responses without the trauma. We copy dysfunctional habits because they feel safe. And worst of all, we mistake these patterns for our true selves. So, when you think about what's normal, your daily routine, your behaviors, your emotional reactions, ask yourself, is it really you choosing these things? Or have they been chosen for you, subtly and invisibly, by a web of psychological nudges, cultural expectations, and emotional patterns passed down through generations? This isn't about becoming paranoid. It's about becoming aware. Because once you see the invisible hands shaping your behavior, you can start to reclaim some of that control. You can start to ask better questions, to pause before reacting, to choose your influences rather than letting them choose you. Because in a world where unseen influence is the norm, the most radical act might just be conscious awareness. Let that sink in.